Hi everybody, and welcome to our second video in the Healthy Minds topic. Today is all about the history and culture of mental disorder. Unfortunately, you will find out that historically speaking, people with mental illness have been treated quite poorly. Good news is that that is still changing for the better. So looking at SACE, our key idea that we're unpacking today is the idea that definitions of what is a mental disorder, that's actually culturally constructed. And then in terms of the area of learning, we are looking at the cultural and historical differences in the concepts of mental health and mental illness. So let's look at a bit of a timeline in terms of our approach to mental illness. We'll go all the way back to the prehistoric and ancient societies. Excuse me. Now, they viewed mental illness as very closely related to religion. So they thought that to be mentally ill meant that you'd been taken over by evil spirits or the devil, and therefore treatment involved things like exorcisms and also bloodletting, so purposefully bleeding people to, bleed the illness out. Our ancient Greeks and ancient Egyptians followed on from this, but they came up with a few different treatments. So they had some medicines, chants and prayers, and also things like diet, exercise and tranquility. So a few different approaches there. Unfortunately, the Greeks did still believe in this idea of an evil disturbance, and that having a mental illness was actually sometimes a punishment by God. Now, Hippocrates and Plato then came around and said that these people who are suffering from mental illness should be looked after by their family rather than being further punished for their condition. We then go to our ancient Romans, who came up with the idea of mania and also melancholy. This idea of the melancholies also continued quite a long way along in terms of European views of this. They believed that mania was caused by a lack of sleep. Could be something like anger, grief or trauma, and it could also be mental exhaustion. And they believed that to treat this mania, you had conversations with philosophers at the time, which is quite cool. Now, 8th century China, this was when they really started segregating people with mental illnesses from the wider community. And they actually believed that mental illness was a result of an imbalance of bodily energies. So they believed that to try and cure this, it was with things like acupuncture. Now, 18th and 19th centuries here, we're really talking about European history now. We have mental asylums. Now, this was like the Chinese had. It's a place to keep the mentally ill separate. Unfortunately, they were quite barbaric. They were more like prisons where people were strapped down. We also have in here, I didn't put it in because, so much detail, we did have witch hunts as well. So in 16th century, around that time, they believed that mental illness was closely related to being a witch. So those of you studying the Crucible or know anything about the Salem witch trials, you'll know what I'm talking about there. Now, heading towards the mid-19th century, mental asylums actually became more humane here. So they called people with mental illnesses lunatics at the time, unfortunately. They were still in asylums, but they were more humane places to be, and we actually had the beginnings of legislation about how to treat the mentally ill. By mid-20th century, we still had some people institutionalized. Most people with mental illnesses were institutionalized, but we had two new treatments that we hadn't seen before, and I guess this came along with the scientific method and advancements there. We had a very barbaric ECT. So this basically involved delivering electrical pulses to the brain and essentially frying it to a degree. So quite barbaric. We also had lobotomies, so that involved removing parts of the brain. So very barbaric at this point. When we then reach the late 1940s, we have the introduction of medications, so psychotropic medications, and this was to really manage the distress that came along with mental disturbances. We then also had psychiatric wards within normal hospitals. All right, so if we look at today, quite different. We do have some people who are hospitalized. This is for extreme episodes, also sometimes to monitor medications. But the focus here is on the humane treatment of the mentally ill to try and help them get better. And it's generally accepted that these people will be discharged and returned to normal life. Treatments are usually in one of two ways: psychological treatments like CBT and medications, and these are often used in tandem. And in terms of a definition, we no longer believe in demonic possession, at least in the Western world as we know it, as we define it. We instead look at behaviours, thoughts, and emotions that impair our daily life and cause distress. Now, the important thing to recognise here is that distress doesn't always manifest itself in abnormal behaviour. So while sometimes you can have abnormal behaviour in people with mental illness, this is not always the case. In fact, it's not often the case. So it's not always culturally abnormal behaviour. We also have ways to classify those who are mentally ill, so ways to diagnose them. So we use diagnosis classifications like the DSM-5, which we'll talk about in class. And this is a way for doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists to be able to have a universal understanding of how we diagnose people. So that's in terms of history, a really brief rundown of the journey of mental illness. In terms of culture, it's important to recognise that TV and media plays an important part in how we view mental illness. So it usually reflects how we see mental illness at the time. So it's usually reflective of the time in which that TV or film is made. Unfortunately, though, these mental illnesses are often very stereotyped or over-dramatised, and this generally does more harm than good for those who are mentally ill. Culturally too, it's important to recognise that not everyone in the whole world has the same definition of mental illness, and that there are still different cultural approaches to this, which then involves different treatment. Lastly, when we talk about stigma, I have a definition there for you, but this is basically that feeling that mental illness is bad and negative and something to be ashamed of. This is still an issue in society today, and we are trying to make efforts to move in a positive direction with that. Now let's look at a past exam question. This was one that came from last year's exam. It was worth 2 marks, and it's asking about the concepts of mental health and illness and how they've changed over time. So this is a simplified version of the timeline that we had, only looking at European countries, and you had 2 marks to describe one way in which approaches have changed. So have a go at this for homework, and when I see you in class, we will go through it together, and I'll also show you another part to this question. We can unpack it together. All right, see you then.